Okay, welcome back to the Big Rethink Interviews. I'm Bryan Alexander, the lead interviewer, and with me is our guest, Chancellor Carrell. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And where are you this morning?
I'm in Rochester, Minnesota at the University of Minnesota campus here.
Excellent, excellent. And with us also are three students from the Learning Design Technology program at Georgetown University. And let me just ask them each quickly to say hello. Hello, Sandy.
Hello, I'm Sandy. I'm an alum of the program and participating this summer in the Big Rethink class.
And where are you today?
I am in Glover Park. It's right above Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Very good. Well, welcome. And Brianna Dean. Hi.
Hi, this is Brianna Dean. I am a part-time student in the LDT program.
And where are you today?
I'm in Dumfries, Virginia, so about 30 miles south of DC.
That's right. Hello, welcome. And Angie Zanuni, where are you today?
Hi everyone, I'm still in New York City and I'm also a second year LDT student.
Well, great. Well, welcome all three of you. Thank you for all of your work and helping make all of this possible. And Chancellor Carrell, we'll begin with some questions. And just one note, sometimes in our experience so far, sometimes the questions balance each other or respond to each other. And sometimes interviewees will anticipate some of the questions. So we might shuffle them around a little bit or compress a couple depending on where we are. So let's begin.
Okay. I'm wondering if you're familiar with our campus being a startup innovation campus, if I need to say a word about that,
why don't you say a word about that, introducing it to us?
Great. So the Rochester campus is fairly new in public university lifespans in that we just finished our 11th year. And we have a vision to transform higher education. And we've been able to pilot all kinds of evidence-based practices. And a result is that with a highly diverse student body, we have equity in educational attainment. Our faculty study student learning and development, and all our students are participants in that research. So we are a living laboratory and we're partnered with the Mayo Clinic and focused in health. So I thought you might like to have that context for my comments.
That says a lot. How far away from you geographically is the Mayo Clinic?
Oh, we are intertwined in
nice.
physical space. So if we are one almost, overlapping in physical space here in Rochester, Minnesota.
Oh, great. Great. Well, this is going to shape some of the questions coming up. So thank you for that extra information. And what a great project. What a great institution.
Oh, so much fun.
Well, the first thing to ask is, what are you seeing in higher education as a whole as it responds in 2020 to these two big developments, the COVID-19 pandemic and also the anti-racist mobilization following the murder of George Floyd?
Seen a really high expectation for action. Like, let's do something and let's do it now. And yet that is happening simultaneously to the great exhaustion. The ambiguity creates anxiety. We use the word pivot every other sentence. The pace of change in the direction that is controlled by external events related to COVID is a very quick pace of change, and all of that has led to, this exhaustion, this weariness, and also weariness with systemic racism. So, those two things together are really challenging. That expectation for action and the exhaustion. I hope that leads us to really refocus on our core purpose, the learners and their learning. And there's so much that is extraneous. The big news story yesterday and today is about football and, the revenue loss there and all of the fans and their disappointment and the participants. I mean, it's more than revenue loss, but that focus isn't our core purpose in education. I also see, a bright light shining on our interdependencies, individually and collectively. Things like parenting, what are the school districts doing, working, studying, the impact of social unrest on well-being, what the faculty need and want to be healthy and safe, and what the students really want and what they need, and who's deciding all of that. So I think the interdependencies were always there, but they're being illuminated, and they reveal conflicts among us, and it's an opportunity to either turn on each other, faculty on administration, particularly, I tested that one, but, or to figure out how to work together. And we don't want campuses turning against each other too, like community college against R1 against, regional comprehensive. So ultimately too, and this isn't a news flash, but the financial situation is something that many in higher ed, and I would say especially faculty, having been a faculty member for a really long time, I just don't want to think about costs, especially in public higher education. And some of the online rhetoric is about greed, and the only reason we're going back is greed. And like, how about we want to be able to cover our payroll, which is different than greed. So this conversation we haven't had robustly about cost drivers, and how we can innovate our way to a different cost structure so students can actually afford higher education. That is front and center, I think. I have a list.
Well, that's a fantastic list. I mean, everything from the anxiety and daily pivoting to the revenue loss, the fear of intersector conflict, and of course, this financial situation. I mean, I know Nakubo has been doing great work in trying to improve the conversation, but I think 2020 is really going to push that hard.
Yeah, I think it really showcases the need for us to lead from within higher education, particularly faculty, for the collective change, as opposed to letting the external events, and they will, but be a disruption that shifts everything for us. So how can we adapt, but be intentional as a collective? That's going to be vital going forward.
Being intentional, being proactive rather than reactive.
It's both right now.
I think the students here had a question about that. Actually, can one of you put that question to our guest about being proactive versus reactive?
Sure, I can go ahead with that one. You mentioned in your previous response the high expectation for action right now, and I think this question kind of ties into that. So we were wondering what your perspective is on how universities are dealing with the current crises that we talked about earlier. Specifically, are you seeing a lot of reaction and reactive changes to external pressures, and maybe some gaps where there are things that universities should have been thinking about and implementing that weren't being done before? Or are you more so seeing that there are things that have been done and thought about ahead of time so that universities were well positioned to deal with current issues and external pressures?
I'll speak to the University of Minnesota and broadly all of our campuses and say that, we, in terms of racial justice and equity, we documented hundreds and hundreds of efforts that already exist. And so I talked before about the great exhaustion. I would also exhale with the great disappointment in ourselves that all of these efforts and our stated commitments and declaration and all of that have not put a dent in systemic racism. And that's greatly disappointing. And then the political context, if I could just, summarize a whole lot in a tiny little phrase, is also discouraging to those of us who've given our lives in higher education, regardless of role, because especially in public universities, we have this commitment to educate citizens for a democracy. And so when we see where's the critical thinking, where's the, ethical, foundation, all of these kinds of competencies that we have thought our lives and institutions have been about. So, the demand for action is for new action, different action, because what we've done hasn't worked. And the impetus to be creative is there. And yet we have this exhaustion and reality of the fear of being ill or making others ill. And so your question itself inspires me, and tonight I hope I get enough sleep to do it tomorrow. And I know that's where a lot of people are.
I hear that. Bree, that's a fantastic question. Thank you. And Chancellor Carrell, I think or Lori, I think that's a terrific answer. You phrased that very, very elegantly. The question of being discouraged, the demand for new, creative, different actions, and yet the fear of making people sick at the same time. These have been qualitative questions and qualitative answers so far, which is fantastic. But we now want to shift ground and ask a kind of quantitative question, which in thinking about this and thinking about how higher education is responding actively or proactively, and how we're changing, what metrics do you track? What metrics do you think we should be paying attention to?
I think we need to be paying attention to many things, but I would focus on evidence-based practices, or what the American Association of Colleges and Universities calls the high impact practices. This is that research shows us in the aggregate that these teaching and learning and student life practices serve equity purposes. They do. So who is using them? Which students get to engage in them? Why isn't it everybody? If we're going to focus in on core purpose, which is learners and their learning, then let's do what works. We're the ones who produce this research as an enterprise in higher education. Why aren't we applying it? We're big fans of research. So, that's what I want to look. What costs are going to be a problem? Finances are going to be a problem. What's getting cut? How are we going to contract? And if we're going to become protective, let's be protective of those practices we know do work. So first year experience programs and undergraduate research, and the list, right? These are the things that students must have if we're going to get to equity. And so, yeah, those are the trends and metrics I'm watching. Of course, I also have to keep my eye on some other kinds of things, like what's happening with refunds, even from last spring, and how does that make or break things, and how does it affect our decision making as we're figuring out fall and trying to avoid lawsuits and other expensive kinds of things. So I'm not impractical. I'm watching that stuff too, but I'm also watching how well we're doing at the tolerance of ambiguity, which is something that's core to learning objectives in most liberal arts institutions.
Sure.
And something we measure here in our students. And yet now, as higher ed professionals, we're also being challenged to tolerate ambiguity. And how are we doing with that? Are we building resilience? Are we collapsing? Are we supporting each other in that? Are we turning on each other and becoming divisive? And the well-being of the whole enterprise isn't only financial, but it has to do with individuals and their energies. So I'm watching that too. Hard to quantify, but pretty important.
That is very hard to quantify, but that's important. And we seem to be living through how to live with ambiguity right now on a major scale. You mentioned grants, rebates, or discounts. I just put a little link to a little blog post about that, where I tried to summarize all the institutions I could find that were doing various forms of discounts for the fall. 10% off if you're online, 15% off if you're, so if anyone wants to look at that, that's.
Well, I think those conversations are so interesting too, because when we listen to the students, we hear what it is they perceive they're paying for when they get to go to college. And then we look as administrators at what are the actual things that cost money. And those two don't exactly line up. So, you know, going online, like, this is a different experience. Agreed, right? And the faculty teaching the courses haven't had their salaries go down because they change modalities. You know, we still have to pay those. So what's driving the cost and what's driving the perception of I'm doing college and this is what college means. So even arguments about recreation center fees, like, well, I'm not there. Well, now we're doing this yoga online. Like, well, it's not the same. True. And yet, you know, we have this contract and we're paying the well-being folks to do their thing, and that hasn't changed. So the expectations about cost and the actual drivers, I think it's going to reveal a lot to us, like which things are extraneous to learning.
Yes.
And how will we then make our choices as institutions, as an enterprise, and as, you know, as students of the future? How will they make their choices about learning? If we can drive down costs by removing some of those things that are more ancillary, will that be acceptable?
Will their preferences reveal for that?
Right.
Oh, thank you. That's a great point, and that points to a couple of questions coming up. So I'll circle back on that. Now let's expand our lens a little wider and beyond 2020. And let me ask you if you can brainstorm or discuss what you're seeing about where higher education goes next. I mean, how is 2020 going to change higher education, starting with your own institution, but thinking about the sector broadly, moving forward?
We're you know, amplifying partnerships. So a primary partnership for us is Mayo, and we have some tech partnerships and so forth. And partnerships in the ecosystem of higher education in our region of Minnesota. You know, how can we collaborate to not just drive efficiency, but to really be better and to hold each other accountable to purpose. I think some of those partnerships are going to include future employer investment in undergraduate education in public universities. And, you know, that's tricky. And corporate values versus higher education institution values, and where do we find ourselves and how carefully do we make those decisions? But there needs to be a funding source, and it doesn't need to be students, especially if we're pursuing equity, you know. So it's, I think partnerships are very much in our future, and maybe within institutions, even systems of higher education like the one I'm in, how can we better work together to drive down costs? And so I also, this is a hope maybe, and that's not the way you asked the question, but I think the great invisible, not touched element, except at Georgetown, is curriculum. That the curriculum itself and the individuality of choice about that's driven by what faculty want to teach and how they navigate a curriculum committee, that whole thing will probably need to be replaced. I don't even want to say reform. It's like a radical change as how do we do curriculum. And there are all kinds of great pilots and, you know, about competency-based and problem-based learning, but like, how do people learn and what needs to be learned? Now, let's start with nothing and shape up something fascinating. And maybe some parts of it will be virtual, but if they're virtual, it better be good, right? So I just know, like, lots of students who are gaming, and then time to go to Zoom. And yeah, here's somebody who can't even break us into groups or pull up their slides without a significant delay. And then I go back into this fascinating gaming world. So, all right, why aren't we optimizing what's possible virtually for the purpose of teaching and learning? So I think that that radical change in the curriculum using virtual mechanisms in a more optimal way that starts with the learner. I hope we'll see that. I do think it's got to be about collective intentionality, and that's my phrase for today, even while individuals are really, really struggling within higher education.
We may circle back on this one too, because this is a huge point about changes in not just the content of the curriculum, but how we do it.
Yeah.
So those amplifying those partnerships. I mean, that's if states can't spend more, and in fact, we'll be spending less, and if we can't ask more from students, where does revenue come from? That's a good question. We have another question here from our students, and Angie, can you put this question to our excellent guest?
Sure, thank you, Brian. Lori, in your most recent blog titled Learning Matters, July Rising, you have expressed optimism moving into the fall. Do you think that the core purpose for educators at the higher level is shifting as we enter this next stage of learning?
Thank you for reading that. The very act of learning makes me optimistic, but not in a Pollyanna-ish way. I know that we can learn, and so I am, enthusiastic for each day, and I know that I can learn. But the fall itself is bringing a lot of fear, and that is realistic. So I'm just trying to think about what we can learn even from that. So what we think we're going to do for fall and what we're actually going to experience will be different. And what does that teach us that we can use? As far as what others are thinking about the fall, it's endless Zooming right now for nearly everyone in every role in higher ed, but from my vantage point for administrators, and there, I see just real care for people, for values. I see that care, and yet extraordinary struggle to manifest it in concrete ways, because the things are clunking up against each other. And the notion put forth by some Minnesota folks in the New York Times this past weekend, that we just really take a national pause, is a place where many are leaning, and yet not a place where most campuses are going. So what's that about? What's that dissonance? And so all I'm doing is re-expressing again, I think, some of the turmoil, but I appreciate the question and the reminder of my own optimism that was in a blog.
Thank you, Angie, for that very, very good question. I love the phrase, learning makes you optimistic. I agree. Let me expand the questions to the greatest possible horizon right now. And let me ask, given everything we've discussed, thinking about questions of equity, thinking about questions of safety in the pandemic, thinking about collective intentionality, how do you see this transformation in higher education intersecting with some other huge trend lines? For example, thinking about, say, climate change, thinking about economic inequality, thinking about issues around technology. I mean, how does this big turmoil bounce off of these other major drivers of change?
You know, I come back to the curriculum on that.
Yeah.
You know, so
Assuming-
that short list you just made, you know, we need to have everything to do with all of that in what we're learning and teaching, and what we're impacting by our learning and teaching. So I don't think any of it can be taken separately. You know, it may need to be that there is this great focusing. And so with fewer dollars, there will be contracting. So what is it at the center of that? How will we make those decisions about contracting? So if we have our short list of grand challenges and we put the learner at the center, what all do we stop doing and paying for? And how do we navigate the transition from what was and the nostalgia of football, fraternities, whatever it is for anybody, and with what needs to be in the future, and what we can creatively, collectively speak into existence. So I think they're all connected.
I see that. There's a lot of interdependency there.
Yeah.
And I'm really grateful for your candor and describing that what we need to do additionally, or what we need to expand doing, but also what we need to stop doing, or we need to cut back. Thank you for saying that. Well, let's look at this from a different angle then. One of our questions that I think is one of the most subtle is, what have these crises revealed about higher education? So you know, what topics, what truths have become introduced into the mainstream of discussion around higher education, either within higher education or outside of higher education? I mean, you mentioned that the interdependencies of these systems are now illuminated very starkly. And you've also suggested that the choices students make will reveal certain preferences as well. So what else has 2020 revealed about higher education?
Within higher education, I think it's become even more illuminated that we get in our own way all the time. So from something simple like, back a couple months ago when the public health experts were predicting that July would be the best month of the pandemic, the least cases, all that. Now that didn't come to fruition, but there was a proposal to start way early, you know, so begin early, get done before the flu season hits, take a long pause between semesters, maybe we'll get to a vaccine. So there was this proposal, but in many systems, including our own, there's a rule about the calendar.
Right.
There's a process about how to change the calendar. And it came out of something really logical and was crafted and put into place probably a really long time ago, but there we were. And that's just like one tactical matter. But I think it reveals how much we get in our own way. We think that policies we've put in place cannot be undone or redone. And they can, and it's up to us. So I think it also reveals a whole lot of things we're not talking about collectively, and money's at the top of the list. So.
No, quite. And that's just gonna it's not gonna fall off the top of the list anytime soon, I don't think. Thank you. In fact, we've seen some interesting cases of private colleges and universities shifting up their calendar in some pretty interesting ways. So that's a kind of, you know, it's good to see that possibility. Let's narrow things down now. We have a few questions that each kind of take a slice of higher education each at a time. And the first one looks at instructional design as a profession. And we ask in part because the LDT program at Georgetown, some of the students come to us as instructional designers, and some go on to become instructional designers. So it's kind of crucial to what we do. And we know that in springtime, instructional designers suddenly clicked into the forefront of everybody's view because they're enabling this rapid migration online. Well, looking ahead, what do you think instructional designers can contribute to higher education during this tremendous year of crisis?
I think that instructional designers will be to higher education what nurses in the ICU are to healthcare right now. You know, that people should be banging their pots and pans and cheering for instructional designers. But I also think ultimately, you know, that what instructional designers know, faculty need to know. And so all of that professional development, translating into, you know, how we do grad school differently so that instructional design is part of the professional development around teaching and learning, and that itself expands within any disciplinary graduate program. Really like to see that. I think there's a shortage. The demand in the spring, as you stated, was very, very high, and where we want to get is not how do you do this in 3 days and switch something that was designed for in-person to online and do it with any degree of integrity. And the instructional designers saved the day on that in many cases, though there are faculty with great experience, that's not universal, you know. But as we go into fall, the questions are different, and faculty who were not asking those questions are asking them now of themselves and of the instructional design world. So as we're thinking about future endeavors, the instructional design center and where it fits into faculty and student life is on the list of important matters. So thank you for going into this arena.
Well, that's good news for the LDT program, but also it's good news, I think, for academia as a whole. Thank you. Well, let's try another slice, which has to do with science, and this really bears on your institution very closely. We've seen in 2020 that different parts of science have really stepped to the forefront of our collective thinking. Epidemiology, public health, healthcare in general are now front and center thanks to the pandemic. And we've also seen social science and humanities research in terms of racism and intersectionality has come to the fore as a result of the Black Lives Matter mobilization. And we've seen some interesting responses. One is that we have a good number of people who enthusiastically embrace such science and research, some who embrace it nominally, and then others who oppose it completely. We're at the stage now where some science is quite politicized. What does this tell us about how academia crafts its scientific messages for the population? What does it tell us about how we try to persuade the public as a whole that our science matters?
I think that there's a great gap, right? So that we in higher ed have yet to embrace our need to be expert not only at science and the social science and our subject matters, but also at public discourse. You know, that expertise needs to be developed among us. And I know the weariness, I come back to that, and just in general, even before COVID, that, you know, faculty saying, this can't be my role. I can do the science and it will take my life and I'm committed to it. But that translation into the public arena is not what I can do. Well, then maybe we need a team so that there is this translator who can speak in multiple modalities with multiple constituencies and in a way that has impact. So for those, you know, we know from Pew who just came into the situation not even validating that there is expertise beyond one's personal experience or social network. But how do we speak into that? So it's not that the science gets better, or that the person with that perception or the masses with that perception just change. You know, it's that we educators, those of us who are supposed to be smart people, right? Like, learn how to do communication in ways that impact this very challenge. It is a challenge to the democracy. It is a challenge to higher education as an enterprise, and there is no one else to take up this responsibility except for educators.
Well, that's a very daunting answer in some ways, that we have to, that we're facing a challenge to higher education, to democracy itself. On the other hand, having to respond with better communication should be something that we do well in education. Earlier, you mentioned, you raised the question of why we don't apply our research to our own work. Does that apply here as well? I mean, is this a case where academia is doing a good job of applying the findings of our epidemiologists to our campuses, or do we need to improve on that?
I'm sure that we need to improve, and at the same time, things keep changing. You know, so I am almost daily, multiple times a week, in meetings with the top public health experts in our state, and I have access to the very best information in science on a regular basis, and it continues to shift in part because the virus changes. So the understanding of, you know, how a virus works is not common knowledge, and the appreciation for science and epidemiology and all that, you know, now the whole world practically can spell epidemiology, which is, you know, like, good. But how that works, and how even if you have that science, you can't stop the contagion of a virus like this, but you can get to principles that affect behavior that have an impact ultimately on the virus if you can generate public buy-in to all of that. And there we're back to the communication element of it. So, you know, are campuses applying the public health guidance, and are they accessing it? You know, my experience here is yes, and I'm certain that that varies, you know, along a continuum, but I think it's the shifting nature of the information and the context of competing sources to the general public, and our need to get that general public to follow the science if we're to have a safe campus, that, you know, complexifies. It's not just are we following it or aren't we, but there's this whole, you know, realm of convincing folks to behave in particular ways and what that takes.
Thank you. That's a good way of us taking our own medicine, or making sure the cobbler's children have good shoes.
Yes.
Well then, thank you. Let me raise another slice, and then one of our students has another question. And this slice has to do with technology. I think one of the revelations of 2020 is that the digital divide is real, it is deep, and it impacts a lot of people. When you think of the upper Midwest, there's a big difference between some of the urban cores and what people have access to and what you get in rural districts, for example. What do you think is going to happen with the digital divide in higher education? How are we going to respond to it? I mean, what's its role in shaping how we revise universities and rethink what we do?
think as we narrow our focus and contract and figure out what we're not going to pay for, tech will be in there, right? That we can't have a digital divide, or else our current levels of inequity are going to worsen. So what that looked like on my campus this spring was driving hotspots to people, you know, and so now we can premeditate. What does that look like? I think there will be some policy changes. So we have many wonderful elected officials in the state who are committed to education, and you know, there's been a proposal about rural broadband, and it'd be hard to imagine it being opposed going forward. So I think we'll see some policy changes and some prioritization of investment in this area. And K through 12, of course, is having this struggle in ways that may affect young people for a long time, and that's very sobering.
That's going to shape students' expectations going forward as well. Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that answer very much. Sandy has a question specifically about UMR, and it has to do with wellness. Sandy, can you raise that question, please?
Yes. We have a question about whether there are any innovative wellness initiatives that UMR has already or has been implementing, or perhaps hoping to launch this upcoming fall to help support and engage both students and faculty. Earlier, you mentioned that the wellness of an institution is not only looking at the financial pieces, but also looking at the individual personal pieces. So we'd like to know if there are any upcoming initiatives related to student wellness or faculty wellness. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I like to talk about this, so that's fun. We do have a real focus on well-being that is established at UMR, and so we're being challenged to, you know, adapt it to the current situation. We do have faculty who are measuring related facets of well-being, and then we use their work to make decisions about what programming we will do. So, for example, our living learning communities and the focus on eating together and multicultural kinds of food events, we find, you know, that affects well-being because it affects sense of belonging, which is a variable that we measure. And so now we're working to adapt what does sense of belonging mean in this time of separation and isolation, and how do we generate that? We also look at resilience and measure that as part of what our incoming students do. They pitch based on the passion that they have to be in a career in health and what the catalyst was for that. And through that process, we have discovered, which shouldn't be a surprise, but there it is, how much resilience matters. So for many students, that catalyst was a childhood experience in health and well-being that was very challenging and they made their way through, whether it was their own or a close family member. So they persevered through something and thus built their resilience in childhood and built their interest in a career in health. And we're seeing, you know, that affects their progress academically and their completion and all of that. So we are looking at coursework and outside of class experiences too, but particularly coursework where we can intentionally build resilience. And now the context itself is making or breaking us. It depends what minute it is, but you know, it is giving us the opportunity to put it that way, to build resilience. So using our own lived experience with COVID as a case study for resilience building, you know, we have a lot yet to learn about how we're persevering now, but that thread within the curriculum is going to be really critical for us going forward. And remember that our students are going into health professions, and so their own well-being, putting on their own oxygen mask first, all of that has always been part of what we've discussed, and you know, is threaded through the curriculum already, but we have new ways that we'll need to adapt. So I appreciate the question, and I know that it's top of mind for a group of us on this campus. So check back in 6 months.
Well, that's a long time off. Sandy, thank you for that question. I mean, it's a fascinating project that you have. I like the echo to first responder protocol. You know, always make sure of scene safety and make sure the responder is safe before going in. We're approaching the end of our allotted time, and I wanted to ask one question for myself, but then I want to open the floor to Bree and Angie and Sandy to see what they'd like to ask. And this is a question that puts you on the spot, I'm afraid, Laurie, and so you can definitely beg off of this question if you have to. You've been extremely candid in terms of the financial pressures that higher education is facing. I mean, you've talked about how we just will have to do with fewer dollars. We can't keep raising tuition. We can't get more from students. We can't expect more from state governments. But at the same time, we have to do more. We have to, as you put it, we have to expand our curriculum to meet some wicked challenges. We also have to spend to take care of all these health needs, everything from mental health to providing PPE and so on. We have to invest in technology to make sure we can do online and blended well. But my question is, what's on the chopping block? I mean, what are we likeliest to cut? I mean, you mentioned we need to rethink the curriculum. What fields, what departments do you think are most likely to shrink? What parts of campus life outside of the curriculum are likeliest to go by the wayside? Like, again, if that's it.
No, I'm happy to answer that. So I think it's not as much doing more as doing what we're going to be doing differently. Okay. So even the question about like which department or which program, I have a real privilege here in being a startup innovation campus in that we didn't ever have departments or disciplines. So we created from the beginning an interdisciplinary department focused on learners, and no matter the discipline, everybody studying, you know, students learning and development. So for this campus, that's not a question. And what I liked to see, you know, on other campuses is a similar kind of approach, right? Well, if we find these wicked problems, challenges, grand challenges, and we're redesigning curriculum with the learner and costs, you know, front and center, what are we going to stop doing, or how are we going to do that core work differently? I think is a more invigorating question, and more maybe to the point of how change can happen in higher education. So what if on a given day there aren't any departments anymore? So backwards design from that date, a new curriculum with interdisciplinary teams doing the instruction. And as you're doing that redesign, you know, also here is some money we saved by not doing this next facilities project, by not doing these ancillary student activities, and there'll be a lot of pain there. But we need to be able to transparently reveal, if we don't do this, then we can do that. And I don't think we have conversations like that broadly in higher education, nor do we, when we do have them, include students in them. So yeah, I think it will vary by campus what that means, but I'd like to circle back, though it wasn't inherent in the question, but just back to partnerships. So again, how do we just do what we're going to do, decide what we're going to do and do it differently? Partnerships would be part of that, as well as interdisciplinarity and willingness to start over with the curriculum, and focus on those, you know, core outcomes and competencies that learners need.
So while we're doing a rethinking of our budgets, while we're doing a rethinking of facilities and the structure of online learning, and during the pandemic, we have core reform and curricular reform as well. This is an extraordinary time. Extraordinary time. I really appreciate your directness, and I appreciate you not saying, don't ask that question. I mean, I really appreciate that.
Well, it's a challenge in real time, you know.
Exactly.
Avoidance doesn't get us far.
You know, we're building the plane in midair, right?
Yeah.
We're building it in midair. Well, we have time for one more comment or question, and I thought I would put this over to you, Laurie, and ask, is there anything that we've missed that we should be paying attention to? And we've been interrogating you right now from a wide range of angles. Is there any part about this big rethink of higher education that we should be thinking about that we haven't mentioned yet?
I think it's been embedded in all that we've been discussing, but that we connect is crucial, and it's all kinds of connections. Students with faculty, around curriculum and costs, we've alluded to, but our personal well-being with what ails us on the grand societal scale, and how those connect. And then the evidence, what do we already know about what works in teaching and learning, and the practice. So connecting the evidence and the practice, connecting the people across roles, connecting the individual to the grand collective. So really looking for those connections is going to be a catalyst for the creativity that is demanded of us. So I think that's an important word.
It really is. It really is. That gives us quite a challenge in all aspects of higher education, from students to instructional designers to faculty to administrators. Sandy has to duck out, but she thanks for the opportunity. And I think we can wrap up on that fantastic note of increased connection.
Well, thank you so and much. I look forward to watching these videos, and would love an update on the students and what they make happen in the world.
Thank you very much, Chancellor.
Yeah, thank you. Stay with it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And,
yeah, you bet. Have a great afternoon.